It's a real privilege being here. I'm a Christian, I'm a scientist, and I've been asked to talk to you today about does science and religious belief. And I want to say this is a little bit of an atypical Veritas Forum for me in a couple ways. I think the most interesting part is that my dialogue partner is not an atheist. Usually when we're having this conversation, it's between a Christian and an atheist. What's really interesting about today, and I'm very excited about, is that the conversation isn't between me and an atheist. It's between me and a man who's Baha'i. Is that the right way to say it? If I have mispronounced things, by all means, just flag me down. And a moderator who's Jewish, of a certain type. That's a little bit of a joke, because over dinner I asked him, what type of Jew are you? And he said, no one has ever asked me that before. Turns out there's an interesting answer. Maybe he'll share it with us later. So I have also an answer here that you may not expect. I actually think that if you really engage science, it really probably should end religious belief. In a lot of ways, it has ended my religious belief. I want to explain to you what I mean by that. It might sound crazy. And really at the crux of this is, what is science and what is religious belief? Okay? Now, before I get into that, it's really important to understand that I am a scientist. And that means that I spend the vast majority of my time not doing Veritas Forums, not reading philosophy, but working on things like this. This is the only slide about my work here, so don't panic, okay? If you are curious more about it, you can go to my website. It's up there, or follow me on Twitter. And I am hiring, too. So if you're a smart science student, come work for me. All right, or with me, I should say. Honestly, science only gets done in community with really brilliant people. And you guys know that a lot of you guys are scientists. How many people here are doing something in science right now? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm probably talking your language here. I put the slide up and say the next things I'm going to say are going to bore half of you and get the other half of you really excited. And that kind of tells who's the scientists who aren't, right? So basically, I do work at trying to understand how chemical structure impacts how our livers metabolize molecules, drug molecules, and how it makes it toxic. So for example, here you can see on the screen a whole bunch of drug molecules and a whole bunch of red circles over parts of it. It's the same chemical structure. It's called a furan. And it turns out that your liver will add an oxygen in a three-member group. It's called an epoxide, if you remember from organic chemistry. And that epoxide is toxic. Now, not all furan rings are epoxidized to become toxic. Only some of them are. And it turns out that we can write computer software that can find patterns that can predict which ones your liver is going to metabolize to make toxic and which ones are not. And you can see here underneath it, the structures is some colors. That's actually the colors that show you where we predict things are being epoxidized. And the two molecules at the bottom are the two molecules that are actually toxic because they're epoxidized in their furan rings. And you can see clearly that it's correctly predicted so. So that's what I kind of do with my day. It's a really exciting thing for me because I feel like it has a potential to have a real impact. By understanding this mundane, esoteric thing, it could have an impact on how new drugs are made and maybe make them safer for all of us. And it's really down in the weeds of science, of basically building models about how you think the world works and then testing them with data to see if you're right. You always think your model is going to work or you wouldn't do it. But often when you do the experiment, you find out the way you saw the world is wrong. That's kind of how science works. It's not really about the big questions about if God exists or doesn't. It's really about small questions and really trying to be rigorous to get as clear and as clean of a model of how the world works as possible. So that's what I do. I'm a scientist. That's what I do. Spend the vast majority of my time on. And what I do Veritas Forums because I like talking to people like you. So this gets to a deeper question even still of what exactly is science. And there's a lot of definitions of science there. Science has a great deal of cultural credibility in our world, so everyone's trying to redefine science to include them. So what I say might feel something that you don't like. I'll just tell you this is kind of where I got it from reading one of the great founders of science. So most people agree that modern science, people have been studying nature forever. You can go back to Aristotle and see people studying nature. But modern science, what we think about when we think about science, what you study in your classrooms, started in the 1600s, and a key thinker in that was Francis Bacon. People call him the father of modern science. He writes this book called Novum Organum, which I really recommend to any student who's studying science. It should be required reading, in which he kind of lays out the philosophical foundations of science. Now, Francis Bacon is a Christian. He's kind of from a Christian point of view. He's reading the Old Testament and the New Testament. He's reading the Bible and kind of thinking through how he should think through studying nature. And he ends up being deeply influential of scientists of all types, including Christians and Jews and Muslims and atheists, all of whom are kind of working together in the 1600s to start to study nature. Now, what's really remarkable to me, which I was stunned by when I first read this when I was your age in college, was that he uses profoundly religious language to define what science is. He says that science is this process of taking down idols. He actually says there's 4 classes of idols. And what is an idol? We don't really use that word a lot. I mean, if you're Christian or Jewish, maybe you hear this at the synagogue or church sometimes, an idol. An idol is like the statue that sometimes in some cultures people worship. But it means something actually much more than that. It's a symbol of something else. It's a symbol of this profoundly human tendency that is in all of us, including me, that we tend to love fantasy over reality. When we encounter reality, we take that reality, we sometimes experience it, but we almost immediately turn to create a fantasy about it. So what's some examples of this? Idolatry in the fact, well, if you can think about war. Look at how war is depicted in video games and how people can get lost playing a video game for days and days and days. It's an image of war that has actually nothing to do with war. No one who really experiences war wants to spend days and days and days in a simulation of war, right? That's like almost the equivalent of hell. Yet there's something about this fantasy that we like, this romanticization of it, this cartooned fun. You can look at games of war, and I mean, I'm not saying you should never play them. It's immoral to play a video game. I'm just saying that it's just something about the human nature that we love that over the reality of actually like trying to understand something about the real world and doing well in our homework and things like that. Another place where I think I encountered it is when I was a little kid, I really wanted a dog. I had a very cartoon image in my head of what a dog was, right? I imagined a cartoon friend, right? To follow me around, I could share secrets with. I did not imagine picking up poop. So the idea of a dog was actually much more salient and powerful for me than what a dog is itself. And the thing about the human condition is that we just love our idea of things much more than the reality of those things themselves. That's what idolatry is. That's what Bacon realized. And what science is the statement that it's very, very difficult to really, truly pursue that reality, to let go of our fantasies, to let go of our idols, and really understand the world for what it is. So I've been a scientist for a while now. I've been exposed to science from when I was little. I've known about this stuff. I've read about it. And there's something profoundly true about human nature that's being taught to us in science. It's in the foundations of science, but it's also in my day-to-day practice of science, where I think I fully understand something, I do an experiment, and I find out I was horribly wrong. And I have to let go of my cartoon understanding of the world and enter into the possibility of this reality. That is the experience of science. It's realizing how little I know about the world and consistently finding ways to exit the cartoon and enter reality. So I think this has a profoundly important effect about how we think about religion. I think the fact of the matter is, when I look at most religions, they look thoroughly man-made. They look fantastical and disconnected from reality. And in this very precise sense that I'm talking about that I see in science, they really seem like we've exchanged something about reality for like a man-made fantasy that looks like idolatry, okay? I don't mean that in a derogatory way, because I do that too. I even see it in Christian religions, to be very clear. This is not something that's unique to everyone except for Christians. It's just like the human state that we encounter reality and then we kind of turn to fantasies instead. And so that's why I completely understand why so many of my colleagues who are scientists are atheists. Because if that's all we were left with, honestly, it's very hard not to see how thoroughly man-made religions are, and just kind of wonder what you're left with. Well, if they're man-made, maybe they're just useful fantasies, or maybe they're useless fantasies. And most atheists just think they're useless fantasies, so they try and get past them. And then some people take more of a pluralist approach, where they'll say, well, they're useful fantasies. They help people be better. So I don't actually believe them, but I think it's a good thing for people to kind of accept something that kind of pulls it together. So we kind of paint in broad brushes. We don't really engage because we don't actually really believe them. We just think they're fantasies. They're like great video games to play, kind of fun. You go to the movies, you don't actually believe the movie's real. And I think I was raised in a Christian family, and as I was getting exposed to science, I think that's kind of the point that I was at the verge of. And I wanted to see, if I was going to remain a Christian, if I was going to believe anything religiously, it would have to be more than just a fantasy. It would have to be more than just man-made. And I really could not find anything in any of the religions that I looked at. And I looked at everything. My family's Indian. I looked closely at Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, all of this stuff. I was young. I'm not saying I'm an expert in all of this stuff, but there is one thing that I came across that I don't know if I can really call it a religious belief, but I can say it's definitely a foundational belief, and that maybe this is that one thing that I found that that's more substantiated than anything else I found in religion, and makes me really question atheism and really makes me question so much other stuff. And it's actually the place where I base my life right now. So this is the reason why I'm a Christian. It's not because Christians are really great people. It's not because I like a lot of churches. I actually have major disagreements with many Christians and many churches. What happened is I came, there's 2 books I'm going to talk to you about here very briefly. And I'll be done. There'll have a lot of time for a question and answer if you want me to go deeper into this. The first one is More Than a Carpenter. This is by Josh McDowell. This is a book that was written back in the 70s where I read about an atheist who had a lot of the same questions that I did, and he started looking into what the core of Christianity was and if it really made sense. And if you actually look at what Christianity is not rejection of evolution. Christianity is not republicanism. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? It's not rejection of homosexual marriage, okay? It's not the Iraq War. I promise you, it is not the Iraq War. Like these things, a lot of Christians will subscribe to, but I'm very skeptical of all of these things. I think the core of Christianity is this claim that's not religious, actually. It's a historical claim. It's a claim that in the physical world that we all inhabit, that the same way how I can make an appointment with you at a coffee shop and we can agree on it and you'll show up, so we're in the same physical world, right? In that world that we all inhabit, that there was a man who lived and died, and then God wanted to clearly identify him as his messenger to the rest of us. And that, honestly, without this, we'd have no hope of being able to clearly identify him. And that he rose that person from the dead to just clearly demonstrate to people of all times in history that that's actually the person he's going to speak through. It's a crazy claim, okay? I get that. If we're going to take if we take it on face value, you'd say, well, we know that people don't rise from the dead. And I agree with you. We know that they don't. If God exists, that seems like a great place to demonstrate that he does exist. So if we're willing to take it as a question mark, is it possible? And then look at history and historical evidence, which More Than a Carpenter lays out in a good way that's accessible for a college student, I would say. And even other people too. I saw a lot of compelling evidence. I'm almost done, just a couple minutes. I saw a lot of compelling evidence that, maybe this is actually something that really happened. Now, there's another book here that I didn't read at the time. This is by N.T. Wright. It's called The Resurrection of the Son of God. It turns out that this is one of these areas that's very similar to areas in science, where the more and more you look at it in detail, at the particulars and at the evidence, then more and more convincing it becomes. And in fact, there's people that have devoted their entire lives to trying to figure out and collate the literally hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and pieces of evidence that are relevant to this, both in the Bible and outside of the Bible. N.T. Wright is one of the leading scholars on this. He writes this book, and it's been interesting to see how some of my colleagues have reacted to it. Many read it, and they find out that actually when you look at the evidence, this is probably, even if you don't accept the resurrection, I think you have to grant that this is the most evidentially supported ancient miracle. Maybe you still reject it, but the evidence is compelling. When I look at that, I found something that was compelling to me. This is the one thing where, I don't think any human effort can raise a person from the dead. Well, I think many churches, many Christian religions that are out there are very man-made. They're in response to this thing that really appears to be the act of God to reveal himself to us in history. And that's why I'm a Christian. So with that, I'll pause and let Joe come up and share his thoughts from the Baha'i Faith, and we're going to go into discussion from there.
I appreciate that this is a dialogue and not a debate. Baha'is are actually not allowed to engage in contention and conflict, so if things get kind of feisty, I'm at a severe disadvantage because I can't really fight back. So I'm sure things will stay civil. Hopefully they do. So, everyone, real quick, if you could, reach your right hand up or left hand, whichever one you want. Reach your hand up in the air. Give yourselves a nice big pat on the back. For being here tonight, I'm sure there's a lot of other things you could be doing. Could be watching TV or doing homework or pretending like you're doing homework while watching TV or actually doing homework while you're watching TV. But you're here, hopefully we'll expand our consciousness and leave a little bit better than when we arrived. So good on you. I'd like to start with a brief introduction on the Baha'i Faith, assuming many of you are not too familiar with it, and then I'll talk about the topic of science and religion, then get into some of my own personal experiences. So the Baha'i Faith is an independent, monotheistic, global religion. There are over 5 million Baha'is worldwide. We're generally a pretty quiet bunch, though we're out there. We have some celebrities, well-known musician Dizzy Gillespie, Seals and Crofts. Has anyone under age 40, heard of Seals and Crofts? Anyone? Maybe a few. Okay, everyone ask your parents. They'll know who they are, hopefully. More recently, actor Rainn Wilson, from best known as Dwight Schrute from The Office. We claim him. Yeah. And also musician Andy Grammer. He's a Baha'i, sings a lot of positive, uplifting music. So we're out there. The Baha'i Faith is actually the second most widespread religion in the world, behind, of course, Christianity. We're doing okay, though. We've been around since 1844, so Christianity's had like a 1,800-year head start. So, it's not a competition, though. It's really not. Baha'is actually believe we're all part of the same divine process of revelation, part of the same spiritual enterprise. So we're all working together here. Baha'is believe that God is immeasurably exalted above our knowledge and that we can never know his essence directly. Because God loves us and wants us to grow closer to him, he sends a series of prophets or messengers, or manifestations is the term Baha'is use, who manifest or reveal God's will to humanity, telling us what God wants us to do and how we should live our lives. These manifestations are sent from time to time, and they reveal the same fundamental spiritual teachings: kindness, trustworthiness, love of others, love of God, generosity, humility, prayer, many others. But their social teachings vary based on the needs of humanity at that particular time. We can appreciate how humanity's needs now are different than they were 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 years ago, because the world is a very, very different place now than it was then. Baha'is believe that this process, known as progressive revelation, has been in place even before recorded history and will continue into the distant future as well. You know these manifestations, by the way, as the founders of great religions, individuals such as Abraham, Moses, Krishna, Buddha, Zoroaster, Jesus Christ, Muhammad, and most recently the Bab and Baha'u'llah, who's the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith. Baha'u'llah's name means the glory of God. Baha'is believe that Baha'u'llah fulfills God's promise that he will continue to guide humanity, and that Baha'u'llah provides the guidance humanity needs for today. Baha'u'llah's fundamental teaching, representing the most urgent need of humanity for today, is that of unity. There's a well-known quote among Baha'is, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. Another quote I like to share that kind of conveys the essence of Baha'u'llah's message is this: possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart. So Baha'is strive to do that. Some of the fundamental principles of the Baha'i Faith include the oneness of God, unity of religion, as I described, oneness of humanity, elimination of all forms of prejudice, independent investigation of truth, meaning that everyone must investigate Baha'u'llah's claims himself. We can't rely on someone else to make that decision for us. There are no clergy in the Baha'i Faith, no one with spiritual authority over any other individual. Along those lines, you might have 10 different Baha'is giving the same presentation on science and religion, and while there are some authoritative scriptures that are the same, and we have the same fundamental beliefs, the way we all approach it might be a little bit different one to the other. Okay, so this is not my view isn't necessarily Baha'i scripture, right? Or it's definitely not Baha'i scripture. Let me just be clear about that. Sorry. Some of the other principles: gender equality, universal education, the importance of prayer and service. We see work performed in the spirit of service as worship. There's spiritual solutions to economic problems, elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty, and one final principle I'll mention is the harmony of science and religion, which brings us to tonight's theme. So let's take a step back to look at this topic and look at from a Baha'i perspective, what is our purpose in life, both individually and collectively as humanity as a whole. Very simply put, on an individual level, our mission is to know and to worship God. That's our purpose. Many ways we can know God, and we could discuss we have entire forums about that very topic. But one way we can know and worship God is to understand His creation, and we can do this through science. Right? Many physical processes have spiritual counterparts. So by using science to understand the physical world, we can better understand our spiritual reality and better know God. For example, we can gain insight into the nature of life after death by looking, which is a spiritual reality, by trying to understand the life of how we came into this life from the womb of our mothers, right? Which is a physical process. We know that the next world is as different from this world as this world is from the world of the womb. Imagine trying to explain to a baby in the womb what this world is like. You know, there's colors and shapes and people and things. Wouldn't make sense to us, just as understanding the spiritual realities of the next world, we can't fully grasp those currently, right? We do know that the child in the womb develops certain things that it doesn't need in the womb, arms and legs and organs and eyes and things that it won't use there, but it needs those for this life. Similarly, we in this life prepare ourselves by developing certain spiritual capacities, which, while they can help us in this world, they're critical to our success and our advancement in the next world. So that's an example of a spiritual principle illustrated by a physical process. From a collective standpoint, we, humanity, have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. Science, which is described as the most noble of all human virtues and the discoverer of all things, is certainly critical to our advancement as a civilization. Science has enabled society to separate fact from conjecture. Further, scientific capabilities, observing, measuring, rigorously testing ideas, have allowed humanity to construct a coherent understanding of the laws and processes governing physical reality, as well as to gain insights into human conduct and the life of society. So that's how science can help us fulfill our purpose in life, both individually and collectively. The Baha'i writings state science is the first emanation from God towards man. Now turning to religion, how religion can help us fulfill our purpose. Religion, according to the Baha'i writings, is the outer expression of the divine reality. Therefore, it must be living, vitalized, moving, and progressive. Many of the greatest achievements of religion have been moral in character. Through its teaching, the examples of human lives illuminated by these teachings, masses of people in all ages and lands have developed the capacity to love, to give generously, to serve others, to forgive, to trust in God, and to sacrifice for the common good. Social structures and institutional systems have been devised that translate these moral advances into the norms of social life on a vast scale. So we see how religion, when used properly, talking about good, quote, good religion here, can help us fulfill our individual and collective purposes. Not only does religion give us these moral and social teachings, but it also, the revelations from these manifestations provide the spiritual impulse, the infusion of spiritual energy and power that sets in motion all the learning, knowledge, and advancement of civilization. To cite one quick example, there are these many stories from during the 1800s of these U.S. patent office commissioners who say things like, everything that can be invented has already been invented, and there's no need for further invention, so let's shut down the patent office, right? So there's these stories out there. Like many good stories, they're not entirely true, but they do illustrate the point that we've had a lot more advancement now than we've ever would have conceived even 150 years ago, right? Went from something like hundreds of patents per year to now hundreds of thousands of patents per year and increasing. So there may be some other physical or material explanations for that, but maybe we could at least consider that there's other spiritual factors at work, and that possibly Baha'u'llah's revelation provided that spiritual impulse that helped to spur all these technological and societal advancements since then. This impulse, by the way, is present in other religions. We can look at the history of Islam and Christianity and other religions and see how advances in society have followed those revelations. Let's look a little more closely about the nature of science and religion. Not just how they relate, but how they actually harmonize. That's the Baha'i principle, how they harmonize. Baha'u'llah states, religion without science is superstition. Science without religion is materialism. Okay, so we want to avoid both of those extremes and have both science and religion working together. The Baha'i writings further state, how can a man believe to be a fact that which science has proved to be impossible? If he believes in spite of his reason, it is rather ignorant superstition than faith. Okay, so we must have them both. It's important to acknowledge that both science and religion are progressive in nature and should be approached with an appropriate measure of humility. let's think about science. Imagine some scientist from some thousands of years ago. Imagine that he or she develops these questions about how the world works. There's a list of 10 questions, maybe, why does the sun move across the sky? How does this plant grow? Why does my pea smell funny after I eat asparagus? Something like that. The list of these questions, whatever they are. The last one, by the way, still has not been answered. Science has no idea why that. So he or she gathers some of their scientific colleagues, and they start answering some of these questions. And how does that process work? They check them off the list. Okay, we got that one answered, got that one. So now we only have 8 more questions, and we keep going to get those. Is that how it works? Not really. So they'll answer one question, and along the way they'll say, hey, well, now there's these 3 or 4 other questions, or 10 other questions that we now have answered. Now we have to answer. And then they start answering those, and they realize that their answer to the first one might not have been completely correct, so they go back to that one, and so on and so forth, right? So the scientific discoveries have this kind of infinite feel to them, like we'll never really be finished with them. So if we approach science with a position of humility, we can more fully accept that and appreciate that. Does anyone here do research, or has anyone done a research project? Maybe some of you. So are you planning to go into research perhaps? I'll tell you a little spoiler alert here, right? So the answer, the conclusion of every research study ever done and ever will be done is very simple. You ready for it? Needs further research, right? Has anyone ever found a conclusion besides that? Every research requires more research. There's always more and more questions out there. You don't come across the researcher who says, well, I guess we answered this question, got that pretty well figured out, so I'm out of a job now. I guess I'll go apply for a job with Uber as a driver or something like that. It doesn't happen. There's always more out there, okay? Similarly, we can appreciate the infinite nature of religion. How can we possibly learn all there is to know about an infinite God from one manifestation teaching for some number of years, right? There's always going to be more to it. So science and religion are both at their best when approaching their questions from a position of humility and acknowledging that there's always more to learn. So let me talk briefly about how I came to my belief system. My father is a Baha'i. My mother is a Catholic. So I went to Catholic schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. And it was not uncommon for me to go to Baha'i classes on Sunday morning with my father. Then he dropped me off at church where I'd meet my mother for Mass. When I was early in high school, 13, 14 years old, like many people start doing at that time, started to really think about what I believe and kind of question and challenge some of my beliefs. I looked particularly at some of the Christian Catholic doctrine, specifically topics such as the resurrection, miracles, heaven and hell, evolution. And I found that through investigating the Baha'i teachings in general, and on these topics in particular, I found that science and religion are in fact harmonious, and that they actually complement each other and can appease my sense of reason in the process. So maybe we'll get some of these specific topics during the dialogue, but generally the understanding for me as a Baha'i is that we're fundamentally spiritual beings. We are souls with a body. We're not bodies with a soul, right? We're souls with a body. And that God is primarily concerned with our spiritual well-being. Religious texts, therefore, rather than describing physical or scientific phenomena, are generally intended to illustrate spiritual truths that help us live in accordance with God's will. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and we'll start the dialogue. So thank you.
So the one point that seemed to jump out as a distinction. Better? The one point. Yeah, now ask your question. No, the one point that jumps out, and I guess as two scientists, how would you approach the different interpretations of this one question? I guess for you, when you're describing why you became a Christian, it's resurrection. And I think, if I'm getting this right, God identified Jesus as the person to carry his message. And when you were describing Revelation, you were talking about that this was an evolutionary process, that it doesn't stop with one. So as two scientists, I guess the question is, how would you determine whether n is 1, as you've posited, or is n greater than 1? So the answer is scientists. How would you approach that simply as a scientific question?
Well, I mean, I guess I just don't know if it is a scientific question, because in science we have this rule called methodological analysis. Can you guys hear me? You guys hear me okay now?
We can pass the
Sure.
microphone. So I guess using science, I don't think science can answer that at all, because science has this rule called methodological naturalism, which means when you do science, you never consider God as a cause. So when you're putting on your scientist hat and you're asking how many messengers of God are, the answer is 0. Not because there are 0 messengers of God, but because science is blind to that and never considers it. So I'm not entirely sure how helpful science, at least modern science, is to that question.
Well, let me just push. How would you come to an answer? How would you come to an answer? You've determined n is 1, and then somebody posits to you, perhaps n is greater than 1. How would you answer that?
Well, I mean, okay, so first of all, I'm not sure if I would say that n is 1. I think God speaks through lots of people. Mm-hmm. But the one where I know clearly he speaks through is Jesus. And so when I'm considering another voice, I'm kind of wondering, is that consistent with the message of Jesus? Because he's the one who's kind of presented like the most compelling proof that he really is from God. Mm-hmm. So I guess I don't think there's only one. I think there's many. I think there's uncountably many. But if someone's going to say something very different than him, I'm just going to wonder, like, well, what's your authority? How do you know that? How do I know that's just another part of the fantasy? Mm-hmm. And I guess I'd be open to see, but I just haven't seen anything that comes even close to anything as compelling as the resurrection.
Okay.
Yeah, so to approach that question, the way I can view science is that scientific theories are based on some number of observations, right? So we make some observations and formulate a theory. When we have new observations, we say, okay, do these observations fit with our theory, or do we have to adjust the theory, or do we have to replace it altogether? And ultimately, most theories are replaced by other ones, right? So I would look at the observation, right? The observations we can make, the data we have about Christ, about Muhammad, about Baha'u'llah, and the other manifestations, and see, okay, does this provide some compelling evidence that they are in fact, divine manifestations? So the criteria perhaps we could use is that of the transformative ability of these individuals, both the ability to transform people's lives individually and also society collectively, right? So if we look at, did Christ's message create this transformative influence in individual people? Sure, the room's probably filled with them, right? Did it transform society? I think you can make a good case for that. Islam, same thing. Does Muhammad's message have that transformative influence on individuals in society? Sure. But the Baha'i Faith, does Baha'u'llah's message have that influence? Absolutely, in my life and certainly many others, and also we can see that starting to play out in society as well. So,
terrific. Thanks to you both. So the next question is about this kind of, where do we draw the line between what's faith, what's religion, what's ethics, and then eventually into what's science? That's a two-part question. What should we make of the way religion has often been used to justify actions we now deem immoral and unethical? I think we certainly have a history of people calling on religion for the most unethical actions. And then the scientific part of the question is, can advances in science move us forward morally as a human race? And I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so maybe I could start with that second one, because it's fresher in my mind. Yeah. So can these scientific advances answer these moral questions? There's a little, I like to tell my students in my classes, I say, a science major in school asks the question, why does it work, right? An engineering major asks the question, how does it work? A business major asks, how much does it cost? And a liberal arts major asks, would you like fries with that? A little bit of a joke. So I spent extra time and money in college to pursue a liberal arts degree, which I completed actually. So I do think liberal arts.
That wasn't very Baha'i.
Can we get some editing in that? Can we delete that last part? So, of course, the point being of that story, there is a point, right? That we can approach these different questions of morality and how do things work from different viewpoints, right? So science doesn't necessarily answer the question, should we do something? It answers the question, how does it work? How does this function? Is this reality? Is this not reality? Then what we do with that becomes questions perhaps for liberal arts majors or others who are interested in studying society and our interactions with each other. And I've forgotten this first question, so maybe.
So when faith or our faiths are called on to do profoundly immoral things, how do we make sense of this? The same faith that drives us into the directions that we've chosen, and we like to think they're profoundly moral, we know people who've drawn on the same faiths to do horrific things.
Yeah, so there's every manifestation reveals certain spiritual truths. What people do with those spiritual truths are widely vary, right? When we have religion justifying bad things, that's bad religion, bad religion. Shame on you, right? So, and that's when people often take the religious teachings and essentially hijack them in order to meet their own personal agendas or their own lust for power or greed or something like that. So, religion at its best needs to help be a source of social good. Otherwise, it's not really good religion. It's not the religion that the manifestations themselves have brought to us. That's what we've made of it, or not we, but some individuals have made of it.
Yeah. Technical difficulties. All right. All right. So. Hello. You guys hear me? All right. So I guess in terms of people using religion for bad purposes, I would just say that I think the vast majority of religion, including a lot of Christian religion, to be very clear, is really is like a very man-made, self-serving fantasy. So it's not surprising at all that people take their fantasy and use it to justify the sinfulness in their own heart. So I mean, I think that's actually almost the rule more. I mean, though I will say, from what I know about the Baha'i Faith, I do very much appreciate that it really does seem to be a religion that does appear to genuinely seek peace. So I don't think that that's the only thing that a man-made religion can do, to be very clear. But I think it's not surprising that so much religious effort ends up being just justifying. I mean, that just seems like a really good use for something man-made like that. I mean, well, not good, you know what I mean. Bad. I guess, can I ask one question? Yeah, so, I mean, one question I have is, so there's a lot that I actually find very appealing about the Baha'i Faith. I mean, there's some versions of religion you encounter and it really scares you and you kind of really wish that people, I mean, the world would be a worse place. I think if everyone became Baha'i, I don't know if the world would be a worse place. It would probably be a lot better. So, I mean, that's a compliment.
Let's try and find out.
Yeah, let's try and find out. But I guess the question that's just in my head is, I mean, you don't immediately strike, I mean, this faith doesn't immediately strike me as like a really dangerous fantasy. It doesn't really, I mean, it doesn't seem dangerous, but it still really feels man-made. And I guess I was asking you about this over coffee earlier, is like, there's other people that have made very similar claims that they were like the second coming of Jesus, that they were there to unite all religions. I mean, there's actually several that have come up. One in particular is Sun Myung Moon. It's a Unification Church. Some people call them Moonies, so that's sometimes considered offensive. But my question is, like, what actually makes you so certain that you're right and they're wrong? And I just don't see any sort of basis to make that claim because it's so similar.
Can you hear from this one? No. Well, I'm here. Yeah. So that's a great question. So for me, it's a matter of both the head and the heart, right? So Baha'u'llah's teachings make sense to me. They satisfy my sense of reason. So that's the head part of it. The heart is when I read Baha'u'llah's writings. This does have this transformative influence in my life. Certainly some of these others whose followers would say the same thing, right? They'd say, yes, this has transformed my life. So we can really, the way we can kind of somewhat objectively answer this question, I think, or at least explore this question, is looking at the transformative influence it has on society as a whole. So let's look at Christianity as an example of this. So during 2,000 years ago at the time of Christ, there was the Roman Empire. That was the biggest game in town. Then there was this Jewish carpenter, right, who was crucified after 3 years of causing some commotion in a small part of the world. So who would have bet at that time that many of you in the room would call yourselves Christians and be willing to sacrifice many parts of your lives for Christ? Probably not many. You'd probably bet on the Roman Empire, right? So there's something special about Christ, right, that can't really be explained through normal, physical happenings. That would never have happened logically, that Christ would still be alive in the way he is in many of you here. So we see the transformative influence over time in society, right? So if we look at that same situation with Islam, we can see that as well. Islamic civilization has thrived during much of the Dark Ages in Christianity. Islamic civilizations were doing quite well. So we can see, okay, is Baha'u'llah's message true? Well, again, let's look at the transformation, right? There's many individuals who have sacrificed their lives for Baha'u'llah's teachings and are still sacrificing their lives in many ways. That's not something people, sane-minded people, do very casually unless there's really a genuine belief of the heart there. So with time, I think we could step back and explore the Baha'i Faith's influence on society. At this point, it's still very, very modest.
So about that,
Yeah.
did I hear you right when you said that you think Baha'u'llah's teaching is a reason why there's been so much scientific progress? I find that to be a very remarkable claim.
Teachings, no. The revelation, right? So
I just see it's totally disconnected. I mean, they were totally different historically. I mean, like, what's the causality? What's the evidence that he had anything to do with that? I mean, like, most people haven't even known about Baha'i Faith, where science has really taken hold over the last 150 years.
Yeah, that's a great question. So from the scientific standpoint, it just looks like it's correlation, right? So Baha'u'llah came, his revelation was in the 1800s, and also during that time we had this great, infusion of energy or whatever you call it into the world, and we have all these technological advancements in the last 170 years. Could it be a coincidence? Could it be a correlation? Sure. That's a scientific conclusion. Wouldn't be able to make that connection, right? That's where there are some aspects of faith coming into it. Baha'u'llah says, I've
So you're not actually positing like an actual mechanism. It's not like there was like
correct.
People, like scientists were secretly reading Baha'i
right,
Faith. Or
correct.
Something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe we'll find that out one day, but no, not to my knowledge.
All right. I mean, I just found it to be a very remarkable claim. I'm sorry. Go ahead. What you were saying.
I kind of forgot what I was going to say there.
Next question.
Yeah. So actually, the last question, summing up, is it has to do with preconception. So as scientists, we try and approach our work without basically allowing the work to take us wherever it will. And so the question is, in each of the faiths, whether either you or others will draw on aspects of your faith that provide preconceptions that prevent good science. And I guess I'm wondering if there's anything, if you think in your hearts, whether there's any preconceptions that you have or foundational beliefs that you have that might prevent an absolute open inquiry into the scientific world around us, or whether other people would call on your faith to do the same thing. I'll start with you this time, Josh.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point because, as many of you might imagine or know, there's been like ongoing, at least cultural conflicts between many Christians and many scientists. Like the big debate, and some people talk about the age of the earth, but often the big debate is about evolution. And there's also the side debate about whether or not science can prove that God exists or doesn't exist. So I grew up probably being taught a pretty similar point of view, but as I've really understood my faith and also what science is, I've really come to a place of realizing that if the Christian God exists, that human efforts to study nature would never bring us to him. It's kind of absurd to think that human study of nature could bring us to a transcendent God. And so if that's true, and especially now as being a scientist and just being so daily acquainted with like the hard limits of science, I just find a lot of this debate, well, that's some preconceptions I've had to let go of. This idea that science could prove that God existed or didn't, and kind of really accept science for the limited effort that it is, and really accept that none of my effort can bring me to God. It really has to be God revealing himself to me.
Yeah, I like the view that we have to. Well, the way I would say it is we have to approach both topics from a position of humility, right? Acknowledging that this God is infinite, we'll never know him fully, and science always has more questions than answers. It seems sometimes. Yeah.
Good. Thanks to you both. So we'll open up the floor. I don't know how the mic folks want to do it. Thank you. So I'll use this one. That one doesn't work. Awesome. So be kind. Be kind. Just a couple of guidelines. So again, we only have about 25 minutes, so keep your comments short. I've been asked actually to suggest preference for the OSU community before the community at large. And as you think about what to say, please prepare in your mind in advance. Keep it short as possible, and ask to whom your question or comment is addressed. Yep. So you have a couple way in the back there. All the way in the back corner there, guy in orange. Sure.
I have a question for Joe.
Try that one.
Quick question for Joe. In terms of the progressive revelation doctrine, it's saying that God does, through different manifestations, provide us with more knowledge of Him. In the Christianity, Jesus is God, and that was 2,000 years ago. With Islam, AD 600, Muhammad would say Jesus is not God. So the question that I would ask, does God's truth change over time? If both these manifestations are true, does God's truth manifest itself and change over time?
Good question. So I guess I would answer, okay, we're doing okay. So I guess both are right? Jesus is God and Jesus also is not God, right? The manifestations have a dual nature. If I think about even myself, I am both a father and a son. Those are two opposite things, but yet I am both 100% those things, right? So we believe in a spiritual sense that Jesus is God and that his spiritual message comes directly from God. So if he says, I am God, here's what I'm saying, in a spiritual sense, yes, that's true. Where clearly he is a man, like many of us, right, and had physical attributes as well. So to say he's not God in the sense that he's a man, that's true.
Well, so first off, I mean, I understand. I mean, I know that's actually you're not ad-libbing. Actually, I think that's actually the official position of the church on that one. I've read that actually.
Yeah,
So see, I find that to be really remarkable because these are like contradictory things. Like either Jesus is God or not God. It can't be both. and like the Christian position isn't that he's God and not God. It's that he's God and man. I mean, I'm not saying. I mean, these are like he's 100% man, 100% God, which is not the same thing. He's 100% God and 100% not God. Like, I just don't know how that actually makes any. I mean, I don't even know how to think about that. Like, even parse it grammatically.
So an analogy that's used is imagine the light of the sun being reflected in a mirror. So if you look at the sun, you see there's one sun, but then you also see the sun reflected in the mirror. Okay, there's two suns, right? Are there one sun or two suns? Well, they're both technically correct. There's one sun because there it is. There's two suns because there they are, one there, one in the mirror. So, we have these types of dichotomies, I guess, but they really can be harmonious, right? In that sense, right?
I don't know how to make sense of that logical contradiction.
One of the really powerful limitations I've found that we have, both in science and in language, is the limitations of words. One of the beautiful things in my tradition of faith is that the deeper you get into faith, the more distinctions start to dissipate. So if you think about colors, they're all separate colors, and then as you get closer and closer to understanding, they all become light. And then they're both light and darkness at the same time. And whether we can understand it, it's like knowing light as a particle and light as a wave at precisely the same time. Whether we know it or not, or can understand it or not, doesn't mean it does or doesn't happen. We wanted to, yeah, that was the guy I was talking about, the guy in the orange. I knew there was orange out there somewhere.
Hey, so thanks for both presenting. I really appreciate it. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just start with
just one.
One. Oh, man.
The
so
best
it sounded
one.
like both of you guys sort of approached things having religion as a baseline and then approaching science. But then at the same time, I'm trying to condense this into one. At the same time, you sort of approach Christianity looking at evidence. So I guess I actually kind of have two questions. Is that evidence like a scientific viewpoint? And really what I want to know is what role does science have to play in approaching religion? So yeah, in your respect.
For me? Question to me? Okay.
Yeah, I think both. Yeah.
You want to start?
Role of science in approaching. So the way I like to look at it is in terms of the scientific processes, right? Observation of data, developing theories based on that observation, and then testing that based on new observations, right? So when we have some observations about the claims of Christ and then the actions of Christ's followers, can we say that there's some divine presence in that? Okay, we can apply those same observations to Islam and the Baha'i Faith and say, okay, is this evidence suggesting that there's some divine truth in those actions and teachings?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, with all due respect, and this isn't an argument. It's genuinely like I feel like there's things that are just so different about the way how we see things. Like I mean, doing science all the time, like science starts with, I mean, it's not just using evidence in a reasonable way. A lot of people have used evidence in a reasonable way from the beginning of time. If we take science to mean modern science, it includes not considering God's action. And so in that regard, I don't think anything in science really tells us much at all about God. You seem to think very differently about this. I think what you're using is something that I would not call science at all. And I don't know really any scientists that would really consider it science either. But I mean, that doesn't mean it doesn't have validity. I just don't know if I would call it science. At the same time, I do think science does help us because it can give us insight into human nature. And I think in human nature, we really find, once again, I think that, I mentioned one, which is I think humans are prone to self-serving man-made fantasies over reality. And I think we also see that humans are prone to coercive abuse of power. And like I think you just see that so thoroughly in science, and I think that informs a great deal about how I think about religion. And that makes me profoundly skeptical of all religious claims. I mean, it takes a great deal to have me even start to think about them. So that's kind of how it really enters into things for me. I don't even know how you can really engage science without coming away from that. I mean, I can understand how you maybe wouldn't agree with me on everything, but it's just the act of science itself just reveals so much about human nature that I come away with so much skepticism of religion. Did that answer your question, I hope? It's getting there.
Let's come into this section here. I'm just going to kind of move gently across the room. Anybody in here? Kind of in here? Yep. There's a mic coming. It is right here. Yep.
Just repeat his question.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just repeat the question.
So I have a question for Joe. So one of the main points that you made that I heard was it's the progressive revelation, and how there have been a large series of people who have given God's will to the people, like interpreted it or explained it. I'm curious if you think that there are any non-religious figures who have done this, specifically scientists, Brian Greene, Richard Dawkins, although I'm not a fan of bringing him up. But are there people, is anyone who has profoundly changed humanity for the better one of these speakers for God, or is it only the religious leaders?
Thanks. Yeah, good question. So Baha'is believe that only the manifestations have a direct revelation from God. Others are certainly inspired by God and can certainly speak and bring people closer to the truth. So, science and religion can both lead us closer to the truth, right? That addresses the other question earlier. Is there like a one truth? Yes, there is. It's God's essence. It doesn't change. Our understanding of Him can change over time, right? So scientists and religionists who are not manifestations can certainly bring us closer to that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the question wasn't addressed to me, but I would just briefly say that I think there are a lot of good people that are not religious. I work around atheists all the time. I found most of them to be very moral people and to be very kind to me too. Like I'm a Christian, I work around scientists that are atheists. We get along just fine. I don't think atheists are the boogeyman.
Nice. There was a question here, ma'am. A comment?
Is that okay?
Sure. If it's a brief comment.
Okay, I try.
Yeah.
I wrote down a few things that I think man is created noble. So that requirement of nobility is, okay, it is like the world is like a bird. One wing is science, one wing is religion. Mm-hmm. And both has to be in harmony together. Otherwise, it will be imbalanced. Yeah. So science discovers the realities of this hidden realities of the universe. Mm-hmm. It's all secret. And then religion also discovers the hidden reality of that nobility that God has deposited in the heart of man.
Nice.
So in that sense, we see that both are important. Both is important, and humanity will serve humanity better if we acknowledge it both, because we have to have the civilization to go forward by scientific discovery, and also religion tells how to apply that science.
Nice.
Because if we don't have that morality, which is religion, the application of that is going to be difficult. We are going to make atomic bombs. We are going to go terrorize people. We are going to do all that.
Yep.
But the true religion, true religious teachings will prevent man from doing that, and that nobility will come up.
Very nice. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I move back there, guy in the. Did you have one? Yeah. Please, while we're there in the neighborhood.
Thank you. So I do have a hypothesis that science, religion, two parallel universes. To be a better scientist, you need to tackle your cognitive biases, because we can't tackle science with our brains. Fast examples, confirmation bias. You try to confirm something that you already believed in. Recency bias. You say, oh, I've seen this yesterday, so today's situation or experiment is similar to yesterday. So my question, or my hypothesis, is basically to be a better person in the other universe, I still need to tackle my cognitive biases. If I tackle my cognitive biases, I'll be a better person spiritually. If not, I'll be a horrible person spiritually. So what do you think about this hypothesis, and how do you tackle your own biases spiritually?
Nice.
So do you want to answer that, or? Well, I mean, so I do science on a daily basis. It's actually really interesting you bring this up, because we were talking about this actually over dinner too. I think science is actually very difficult to do, because it does ask you to basically deal with your biases in a way that is very, very unnatural. And one thing I will say that was a very big surprise to me is that many of the things, or many of my experiences coming to terms with spiritual truths in my faith, kind of built a character that made a lot of things, at least for me, a lot easier to do as a scientist in terms of dealing with those biases.
So in one of the quotes I put up on the screen says, possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart. So having a pure heart gets at this issue, right? We have to try to genuinely seek the answers to our questions without bringing in these biases. And obviously it's very difficult. One of the Baha'i virtues is detachment. Try to free ourselves from any attachments we have so we can be pure and earnest seekers after the truth. That's a lifelong challenge that we have. And if we acknowledge that we do have these biases coming in, we can more appropriately combat them and have that pure heart in our search.
Nice. So a guy in the red hat back here had a question.
My question's for Mr. Swamidass. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I know you mentioned it was kind of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It was like the factual basis that made you really appreciate the Christian faith. And I'm just wondering, it seems like, of course, the Bible is, of course, written by people who really didn't know Jesus. There's things like the Shroud of Turin, but that's obviously not conclusive or proven. It's not my quote, but, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I was just kind of wondering briefly, what are kind of some of the main points of that extraordinary evidence that led you to believe in Christianity?
That's a great question. Especially given that my starting point is actually a great deal of skepticism. Well, what I would say, first of all, we have to kind of think about what the extraordinary claims are. So if you talk to an atheist, he'll tell you the belief in a God is an extraordinary claim. But I actually think if you look around, most people are just predisposed to it. I think actually belief in no God in some ways is an extraordinary claim. So I'm not willing to say belief in a God is an extraordinary claim. So that's the starting point. Secondly, saying that people are willy-nilly rising from the dead is certainly an extraordinary claim. But that's actually not the resurrection, okay? That's not the claim. The claim is that God is trying to make himself known to us because we can't reach him on our own. And because there's so much false messages of who he is, that he wants to do something to make it so clear that's him who's doing it and not us. And so he's going to do this one thing in history and also make sure that there's strong evidence for this in history. Okay, that's the claim. Now, you can disagree with the claim, but at least just understand what it is. Okay? So now, to actually engage that claim, you have to put a question mark on whether or not the resurrection happened, and then start looking at the evidence of what actually happened 2,000 years ago in first century Palestine and in second century Palestine to see, does that actually make sense with this? Or does this really look like a man-made myth? For example, one thing that would falsify that claim is if you look at all the manuscripts that were claimed to be from that time, as soon as radioactive dating is invented, you test them and you will find out they're all from the 5th century BC. I'm sorry, not BC, AD, right? That would clarify that, oh, this is patently much, much later. We just see no evidence of this at that time, okay? So that'd be an example of evidence that would, if you could just never find anything that's like closer to that time, it would raise a lot of questions. Another example like that is there's several very precise examples in the Old Testament. For example, Isaiah 53, which describes someone who looks a lot like Jesus, bearing the sins of the world, being a light to the Gentiles. You know, all of the core theology you see in Paul and in Jesus, you kind of laid out. And one claim, it's so salient that for a long time people claimed that actually this was written by Christians after the fact, and then somehow snuck it into the Jewish Bible. So you can actually test that claim to see if any of these manuscripts date to before Jesus, and it turns out that there are manuscripts on exactly those claims that date to like 200 BC. And so, like, when you start looking at things like that, you see like this picture, and I'm just giving you tiny, tiny pieces of it, okay? Literally, there are about 100,000 manuscripts that are directly relevant to this, both as part of copies of what we would call the Bible, but also Jewish and Christian and Greek historians of that time writing about this, where you actually look at it. And then also, I mean, one of the more profound things that I think is a much more recent look at it is we've come to understand how the ancient mind thought about religious things at that time. And you can ask the question of, would the ancient mind have actually expected the resurrection of a person? Can you see any sort of precedence for that? And this is actually what N.T. Wright has spent a lot of time working out. And this is actually some of the most convincing evidence. What's so profound about this story, and even how the story is told, it's not like Jesus said he would die and rise again, and everyone believed them. He died, he rose again, and it was just an open and shut case. Really, the story is that he rose from the dead, and it took a lot of effort to convince people because it was so profoundly unexpected. It was so unexpected, and in fact, you can look 100 years before and after Jesus as people making the same claim, and people just not caring about it and not believing it. And in fact, even at that time, you see people saying, well, you know, we can believe people can metaphorically rise from the dead. We believe people die, you know, who rise from the dead, you know, in the afterlife. But you're saying this guy died from the dead just last week. You're crazy. Yet they were willing to stake their entire lives on that. And it's important. Like, they died for their faith. And this is one thing that I do would say is actually is similar to what's happened in the Bahá'í Faith. So, I mean, I want to acknowledge that too, is that they were asked, I mean, they were not dying for the faith like going up and blowing up their enemies, okay? They were dying for the faith saying, you know, all you have to do is recant the resurrection. And yet they wouldn't, and they died horrible deaths. And this is after being totally terrified, people like running around. And all this is very well established historically, to the point that even people who do not accept the resurrection, who study this for a living, you know, will agree strongly that this is the most substantiated ancient miracle. Now, so when I think about this, if God, when I look at Jesus, and if the resurrection is true, what I see is a God who's so intent on making sure we understand who he is in history, that if he was to bring some other messenger, it would have to be something equally impressive. Something that would be so clear that, so I could kind of cut through all of the confusion and static in this world, because it's so easy to invent a religion that, and if that God exists who brought Jesus into the world to speak to me, he rose him from the dead. I mean, I just don't see anything comparable yet.
Judge, you want to take on some of that?
Yeah, so just a little bit of my thoughts on the resurrection. You know, we can all agree that Jesus' body is not physically alive right now with us. We could probably all agree that, or he's hiding very well. But nonetheless, maybe something. Okay, so even okay, most people would probably agree that Jesus is not physically, his body's not physically with us now, right? So
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by that, but go ahead.
Okay. So
I mean, okay. To his physical body, but I do think he was bodily resurrected.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, people in this room would certainly make sacrifices for Jesus and the Spirit of Jesus and have lived their lives according to Jesus' teachings. So the faith in Jesus is not dependent upon his physical body being with us presently, right? So what the Baha'i view in terms of the resurrection, which makes sense to me, is that At the time Jesus was crucified, many of his followers went into hiding. They were afraid that they would also be put to death, so they stopped teaching the message of Christ, right? They were not living Christianity. The faith of Christ was, quote, dead, right? After some days, they started coming out of hiding and saying, hey, Jesus taught us these things. We need to start doing what he asked us to do, hence resurrecting the spirit of Christ's teachings. And that's the true significance of the resurrection. And we can see that the proof of Jesus would therefore, to me, be what these individuals did after the resurrection, right? After this resurrection event.
Do you believe he was bodily resurrected or not?
I believe it's the resurrection describes the spiritual reality of the followers of Christ arising, resurrecting Christ's teachings, and starting to proclaim them as he instructed them to do.
So we're only going to have a time for a couple more. So I want to get
I would
this
just say,
last.
if that was true, I'm quite certain. If I came to believe that, I would quite certain I would not be a Christian anymore. There's no point in being a Christian if that's not true.
I want to make sure we get some of the folks back in this last corner in here. Anybody in there? Nope. All the latecomers not interested? Okay, got one way up front here, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Should I say it? I got it. Stand up. Oh, and then I'll hold it for you. Oh, got it. Yeah. So I mean, basically, you guys each touched on a point that, like you mentioned, that it seems that religions look very man-made, and then you mentioned this quote that religion without science is superstition, science without religion is materialism. And so my question is, I mean, these both to me seem to suggest then that there is sort of like definitely a divine force behind religion, and that, you know, we're human, so that may be different from what we as humans choose to do with the teachings of religion. And my point is that you seem to have made this distinction between religion as it was taught and brought to us, and religion as maybe sometimes we practice it as human beings. So I was just curious if you guys could both just give your thoughts on that topic.
I think you kind of captured my thoughts on it pretty well. You know, there's religion as it's taught by the manifestations, and then what people do with it is often in line with those teachings. Sometimes it's based on their own misunderstandings, misinterpretations, or just some sort of corrupt lust for power that causes them to distort these teachings.
Honestly, I don't entirely understand the question. What was it exactly?
So my question is just, some people would say if someone is a Christian and does something, I've heard people suggest that then Christianity must believe that, even if it was like. So you seem to make a distinction about that, and I'm curious where that came from, where that.
Okay, I see. Okay, so I mean, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of people who take religion and use it for bad purposes. I think sin or like this impulse to do bad things is in the human heart, and we'll use whatever's around us to justify it, and that includes religion. And so certainly people have used Christianity that way. And I guess I can be very skeptical of a lot of Christians and a lot of Christianity and a lot of churches, because they are honestly, at their best, they're just man-made responses to this act of God. I think the real call in that I see in history is to respond to Jesus. And while I'm skeptical of many Christians, I have no skepticism about Jesus.
So it turns out we have time for one more. This guy right here.
So both of you guys mentioned that science can play a role in religion in providing, I guess, like a purifying process, almost like you mentioned idolatry, removing idolatry, as well as you mentioned conjecture and maybe vain imaginings towards religion. So I guess my question would be if you have any examples, I mean, specifically maybe more in recent times where that's been able to happen. Where science has provided the removal of idolatry in religious beliefs, maybe a misinterpretation within a religious community or something like that. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I would say I see it throughout science. I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about a lot of atheism. And so I spend a lot of time with atheists. I think there's an assumption that if you're an atheist, because you don't believe in God, you've kind of moved farther away from Jesus. But I actually think it's the exact opposite. I think atheism, I think science really kind of exposes most religious practice for what it is, as man-made. And I think that actually makes it easier to see the uniqueness of Jesus. It's actually really common among my colleagues to be very curious about Jesus, and there's even really prominent examples. A great example is Francis Collins. He wrote a book called The Language of God. He's an atheist. He encounters Jesus. And I think one of the great things about science is it kind of really creates like a character in people. They really want to know the truth. They really don't want to accept the fantasy. And a person like that is really kind of at that verge of coming to Jesus, frankly.
So to think of an example, I don't want to open this can of worms, but the debate between creationism and evolutionism, as we learn more about science, the fossil record, and these types of questions, that's now brought into question some of the religious beliefs about how has creation happened. Did it really happen in 6 days? One science tells us it took much longer than that. So that might be another entire forum, perhaps. Yeah. But that might be an example of one of those examples.
So our last couple of minutes, a lot of this has been question-led or directed. The question is to each of you, and we'll reverse the order. Joe, you go ahead and go first. 2 minutes, whatever you don't feel was covered well. Anything you'd like to add? Any last message for this room full of dedicated seekers?
I did jot something down, so I'll read that to make sure I kind of get this concisely and clearly. So this is just my final thoughts. I would encourage everyone to seek to expand your consciousness both scientifically and spiritually or religiously, and start to see the connections among different things. Approach questions with a pure heart, open mind, and from a position of humility, acknowledging that there will always be more to learn and that our journey will never be complete.
I guess I want to make a comment. So it's kind of the way of academics to debate about ideas back and forth. And I know you're not supposed to debate, so sorry. I do want to say that I have very positive feelings towards the Baha'i Faith. I don't think you're like a force of evil in the world or anything like that. I think it's important to stay because I think sometimes people act as if you disagree with someone. They're really the big problem. I mean, honestly, I wish what you were saying was true. I just can't get my head around it. It just doesn't. I mean, I feel like I have to check out of any sense of reason to go that way, and it's just too hard for me. But I wish it was true, and I do wish that even if it's not true, that you would be very successful in convincing more people to pursue peace in this world. So that's something I do think that we all have to look up to your faith on. So thank you.